My name is Nancy Kogel, and we're doing a show for Joe Friendly, Truth for a Change. And on my right is Noam Mohr, Yale physicist, who will be talking about global warming and what we can do to minimize it and stop it. And he'll talk more about that. And on my left is Bob Wagner, and he'll be talking about the causes of global warming and also how we can minimize it. So why don't we, or if it exists, but why don't we start, Bob, with you? Why don't you present?
All right. What I've been doing is I've been going around giving this presentation having to do with the theory of global warming. And the commonly accepted theory is that man's production of CO2 is leading to a global warming phenomenon. Every time I would look at the data and look at the conclusion reached from this data, I would see that the data was painting a different picture than what they're saying. And so what I've done is I've created a presentation that goes through the other possible explanations for global warming: the sun, water vapor, the orbit around the Earth, orbit around the sun. And so when I put everything together, I think there's a much more solid argument that global warming is a natural phenomenon and is not being caused by man. Man's contribution to global warming, in my opinion, and I think the data would support that, is marginal, if at all. Man produces a very small fraction of atmospheric CO2, which is a very small fraction of the atmosphere itself. So.
And what would you say to that?
There are a number of things that that influence the world's temperature, and certainly the sun is one of them, and aerosols and volcanic eruptions are among them, and natural carbon dioxide and methane are all important parts of the natural process which keeps the Earth warm enough to sustain life. But what's been happening recently is that since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been emitting enormous amounts of these gases that trap heat to the Earth, so much so that the air we're breathing now has 30% more carbon dioxide and double the amount of methane it did just a century ago. So these are very detectable, very serious changes in the balance, the natural balance, which keeps the world's temperature so comfortable for us. And the effects, we're already seeing enormous effects. There are a lot of things that influence climate, but scientists have been studying this for a long time. There's an enormous body of evidence for the fact that global warming is happening and that humans are causing it. They've looked at things like the influence of the sun and water vapor, and they've worked it into their models and their calculations and looked at ice core data, and what they found is that none of these things can explain the warming that we're seeing. And just recently, the International Panel for Climate Change, a world's body of the top climate scientists internationally, have put together a consensus document that said not only is the evidence that humans are causing global warming, but that they're 90% sure that humans are the main cause. So when the world scientists, a near consensus of world scientists, are saying that this is happening, it's 90% sure that we have something so serious happening that it could cause enormous devastation, extreme weather phenomena, spreading disease, rising sea levels, coastal flooding, mass extinctions. This is something we need to take seriously and do something about. So the question should not be, is global warming happening anymore? For that, the scientists have come to a consensus. The question should be, what can we do about it? And simple steps like getting fuel-efficient cars and appliances and light bulbs, and recent research has shown one of the most powerful things we could do is changing our diet, because animal products we eat cause more global warming than all the cars and trucks and planes and trains in the world put together, according to the UN. So this is a powerful thing we can do today to improve the planet for our future, for our children.
That's the point that the IPCC will take, and as you point out, there is a consensus. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going against the consensus. Christopher Columbus went against the consensus. Back in the 1970s when they told us about a coming ice age, I was against the consensus. Just recently, you found out there's a consensus against silicone breast implants, and now the FDA has them back on the markets. So consensus, typically what you find in science is that if they argue that there's a consensus, it's because they're not willing to really take a look at the data. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the data, because as you're pointing out, you're saying that the man has been producing a great deal of CO2 during the industrial age. And that CO2, even according to the IPCC, is what is causing global warming. Correct? If you take a look at that, and Paul, you might want to get this chart up on the computer. This is really what we're talking about. You see that the atmosphere is essentially 78% nitrogen. Oxygen is 21%. The other is 1%. CO2 takes up 380 parts per million. That is 0.00038 or 0.038%. This is essentially a trace gas. If you take a look down here at this lower right.
Now you can't, when you're pointing, I can't see that, so you'll have to describe.
I am down the lower right.
For their sake, you can point.
Yeah.
But make sure that you tell the audience, describe what you're, because all they can do is see the chart.
Do you want me to back up and start again?
No, it's fine.
Okay. And as you can see, man produces 5% of that 380, and so it produces approximately 0.00019 of those parts. Essentially, 180 parts per 10 million, or 0.0019%. So CO2 is a very, very small fraction of the atmosphere. If you take a look at the lower chart there, you see that those two little thin lines, the one is all of CO2, and that other thin line is man-made CO2. So you can essentially see
the thin line is green or red.
You can't even really tell. It's such a small sliver. They're those two very small black lines. That's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about anthropogenic greenhouse gas causing global warming.
There are two slivers.
The one is all CO2, and the other one is man-made CO2. The problem is it's so small, the computer can't even show you the difference, that the one is 20 times wider than the other one. Okay? So we're talking.
The wider one is the one vertical on the top, right?
Yeah, they're both those two very fine lines. Those are atmospheric CO2 and man-made CO2. The man-made one is literally 20 times thinner than the thicker one, and you can see that they're both very thick. The point here is that atmospheric CO2 is so very small that it's almost a negligible gas. Now, when you're getting back to CO2 causes global warming, being a physicist, you know that anytime you do a cause and effect relationship, you need to establish a timeline, right? The cause must occur before the effect, right? There's a critical timeline. I drink a fifth of vodka and then I get drunk. If I get drunk and then I drink a fifth of vodka, you can't claim that me drinking the fifth of vodka got me drunk, correct?
Sure.
Bottom line is, so when you take a look and you're saying CO2 causes temperature to increase, you have to take a look at the correlation studies between CO2 and temperature. And what you find is that temperature leads CO2 by around 800 years. What actually happens, it's a natural cycle, is the sun heats the earth, things grow, they start to produce CO2, and then CO2 starts to increase. I'm sure you know from running any kind of a model that they just simply reverse their independent and dependent variable, and by doing so, they're always going to be able to show temperature increasing with CO2. The problem is the temperature increases first, causing CO2 to increase, not vice versa. So for some reason, Mother Nature has a built-in mechanism where she likes to increase greenhouse gases with an increase in temperature. She does it deliberately.
I think that is confusing the issue, which is it's a fact that carbon dioxide and other gases, methane, nitrous oxide, these gases that we emit and also are emitted in natural processes, these do trap heat. And you can calculate how much heat it traps. And that, you said it's a small fraction of the entire atmosphere, but that small fraction is strong enough to keep the Earth warm enough to sustain life.
Well, right, here's the chart you can refer to about the absorption of infrared radiation. If you'd like to explain, here you have.
These ICPs.
Oh, this is not the IPC. I don't know if this is. It has the source right down at the bottom. But this is an infrared absorption chart that shows the greenhouse gases. And by the way, you're pointing out that not only is CO2 increasing, but all greenhouse gases are increasing. Man doesn't produce most of those greenhouse gases. Mother Nature does. So for some reason, Mother Nature is deliberately increasing not only CO2, but all of her greenhouse gases. So it's a solid theory to me wouldn't go out there and say, okay, there's a natural phenomenon of all greenhouse gases going up, but because we can tag man being responsible for CO2, man's responsible for CO2, and we're just going to ignore the fact that all these other greenhouse gases, to me it's more logical to think there's a natural phenomenon going on that's leading to all greenhouse gases going higher, and that's Mother Nature.
The reason that greenhouse gases are increasing in the atmosphere is related to the fact that humans are putting these out. Methane and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide are all major gases that humans are producing. There is a natural cycle. Most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is created naturally, and that's great, because without that, we wouldn't be able to survive. The planet would be frozen. But it's the fact, that small additional amount that's building up over time, that's trapping more and more heat. And that's what's causing more and more of the climate changes, which are unprecedented. And you can see that the more carbon dioxide and methane that we emit, the more we see it in our atmosphere. In the beginning, a lot of people were not sure about the data. They would say things like, well, this place it seems to be going down a little cooler, or this place that seems to be heating up before the carbon dioxide was emitted. But as we put more and more data and more details into our climate models, which climate's very complicated, we get more and more confidence in the fact that indeed it is our emissions which are causing this. And like I said, the scientists have been studying this for a long time, and every report they put out becomes more and more confident over time.
I'd like to also talk about the fact that you mentioned that it was Mother Nature that put it out, and in a way our ideas may converge in the fact that if we're including methane and nitrous oxide gases, which on some people's in some people's account or studies show that methane is 23 times more GWP or global warming producing than all the cars, power plants, and CO2s put together, and that nitrous oxide is 296 times more global warming producing, and that both these, methane gas and nitrous oxide gases, are produced by animals, which, yes, it's Mother Nature, but humankind, I'm not going to say mankind, I'm going to say humankind, breeds these animals to abundance to produce dead animal flesh, which we know is not necessary for humans to survive and can be quite toxic because our physiology and our anatomy is made as we are herbivores. So not only is it not necessary, not only is it disease producing, but because these animals, through their natural digestive processes, which is part of nature, produce the methane and nitrous oxide gases, are also destroying our planet faster than anything else.
And Paul, if you want to show this slide right here, this gives an example.
You didn't explain the other slide, but that's okay. I mean, just be careful not to race on too much, because they're loading on so much stuff that you went over.
Okay.
I still don't know about CO2.
Okay, we'll get back. I was just gonna show this is what she's talking about when she says methane is much more powerful. If you see here, CO2 is a relatively weak greenhouse gas. As you can see over here to the far right, it has what's called the global warming potential, and it has the different time horizons. But carbon dioxide is assigned the value of 1. Every other greenhouse gas is relative to carbon dioxide. And you see methane over a 20-year time horizon is 62 times more powerful than CO2. Nitrous oxide is 275 times more potential. So all of this hype or all of this focus is on an incredibly weak greenhouse gas to begin with, and we're producing a trace amount of an extremely weak greenhouse gas. But more importantly, you're mentioning methane. Man doesn't really produce very much methane. What produces the majority of methane in the atmosphere is bogs, agriculture, and termites decomposing wood in the forest. So once again, there's a natural phenomenon going on increasing these greenhouse gases, and Mother Nature is the one that's producing A, the vast majority of CO2, and B, the vast majority of every other greenhouse gas. She's just simply increasing all greenhouse gases, man-made or not. She's doing something deliberately. So if she's doing it, I think the more interesting question is, why would Mother Nature be doing this? Because she's not messing up. I think the environmentalists are misreading what she's doing.
With all due respect, the scientists have been looking at this for a long time, and while you're certainly entitled to your opinion and to try to convince other people, the vast majority of people who look at it, not just in the scientific community, but in the public, have come to realize that this is a serious issue that we need to face, that these increases in greenhouse gases are not explained by any natural phenomena. but can only be explained by human influence. And that's why it's a really important point that you both made about methane, because methane is so much more powerful at warming the Earth than carbon dioxide, even though carbon dioxide is produced in vastly greater amounts by humans than methane is, because methane is so powerful. That small amount has a big bang. And by reducing our output of methane, we can make a big difference for the planet.
Well, how would we do that? We would drain our bogs, we would cut down our forests, and we would exterminate the termites. So if you go with that argument, you got to start. What's the solution to stopping methane production?
Good point.
Killing our forests.
Well, the methane that is being produced on Earth, unlike carbon dioxide, which is mostly produced naturally, but there's about 3% produced by humans. That 3% does build up over time and make a difference. With methane, humans produce more than half of the methane that's being produced, more than the amount that's being produced by nature. And the biggest source of that is animal agriculture. It comes from the digestive processes of the animals we eat, and also from the manure that they produce. That's the biggest source worldwide.
That's assuming that if we weren't, because I've read that statistic, and that, to me, that's a very suspect interpretation, because what they're claiming is that animals, because we eat animals, we're responsible for the CO2, the methane that they're producing. Those animals probably would be there and more if it wasn't for us. If you can, I could just simply point to the buffalo herds that we used to have that used to blacken the plains. Okay, man through urbanization has done a lot to squelch many animal populations. So on a net basis, I don't think that argument's going to hold. Mother Nature, you'd have, like I said, from what I understand, the vast majority of methane is produced by decomposing wood from termites and bogs, not necessarily agriculture. And agriculture is going to exist whether we do it or not. Mother Nature is going to fill that void with a plant that decomposes and produces methane. So that argument, I think, once again, you're arguing against Mother Nature, not a man-made cause.
That's a common misconception. But it's because people have no idea how many animals that we raise for food. The vast numbers are hard to fathom. In this country alone, we raise more than 10 billion animals a year for food. That's vastly more than have ever existed in nature. 70% of agricultural land in the world is being used for raising animals. 30% of the entire land mass of the Earth is being used for raising animals for food. And the total numbers are just incomprehensible and far more than existed in nature. And that's why, when you add up all the methane that they produce, when you think of one animal in a field, you don't really, it's hard to imagine that it could be changing the entire climate. But the vast numbers, it's just incredible.
And it's on the rise. It's accelerating because they're spreading this meat-eating culture to, for example, India and China now, whereas before they subsided on mainly the abundance of the plant universe: rice, beans, lentils, split peas.
Right. Well, rice is a good example. Rice is a good example of a major methane producer.
Right, but 80% of all the rice-like food goes to feed animals. It's for every pound of protein that's produced by eating a dead animal, there's, I don't know, I think it's 16 pounds of protein produced by eating plant food, well, which gives you more than enough protein.
I'd have to see
efficiently.
I'd have to see. I mean, because I don't know how we go back and quantify how many animals used to be here, but I do know that we had vast plains of buffalo that would blacken this country. It takes hours, if not days, for a herd to go by. So I'm not aware of the statistics that could show that we have more animals today than back then. And you can't make an argument that those animals back then were pretty doggone big.
They were big and they roamed, so people saw them more. Now we have them in factory farms, and it's vastly more than the amount of buffaloes that lived on the plains.
But let's get back to this. This is the Paul, if you want to show this chart up here. This is essentially the backbone of CO2 caused global warming. If you look at the very bottom rectangle there, it says total atmosphere. That's the total absorption of infrared radiation by the atmosphere as a whole. Okay? That's the entire infrared spectrum and where it is being absorbed. Now, if you look directly above that, you see another chart that shows the absorption of water vapor. And as you can see, water vapor is almost exactly like total absorption. So whenever you discuss global warming, the major factor of global warming, and when you're saying that without CO2 we would freeze, I would totally disagree with you. I would say without water vapor we would freeze. CO2 is insignificant for temperature change, and I'll show you a slide here in a little bit. But as you can see, water vapor is by far dwarfs anything out there as far as the greenhouse gas effect. Now remember, there's also other factors that include warming. You don't necessarily have to have a greenhouse effect to remain warm. You still have convection and conduction, not necessarily just radiation, which is this. So there's many ways to maintain warmth, and you don't need a greenhouse gas effect. But the bottom line is, as you can see, water vapor clearly is the dominant greenhouse gas, and it's responsible for 95% of all the greenhouse gas effect. Now, a normal scientist, whenever in healthcare you say common illnesses occur commonly, meaning that if someone comes into your practice and they say they've got a problem, you think about the most likely cause of something, not the least likely. So when you look at this chart, you sit there and you say, you know what, water vapor is probably the most likely cause. If you're creating a model, a physics model, you would say this is a highly significant variable, this is probably an insignificant variable. When you look at the power and the impact, the CO2, you've got essentially two small little humps there.
No, you gotta say it. You gotta describe. That's the first line.
Okay, if you go up 3, you see where it says carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide has 3 absorption peaks, 2.7, 4.3, and 15. That is all man-made greenhouse gas theory rides on. Those 3 very narrow peaks of infrared absorption. That's what infrared or CO2 absorbs. That's the heat that it traps. So it traps those 3 little bands. The problem is that first band, as you can see where I dropped that vertical, that red line perpendicular, you see it goes through the peak of CO2, but right below it, it goes through the peak absorption of water vapor. So at that wavelength, you could have no CO2 and there would be no change at all because water vapor already absorbs 100% of that radiation. You go over to the next one. That's the only one that is, or pretty much the only one that stands on its...
To the next peak.
You go over to the next peak.
Okay, and there's a
Yeah,
line
and if you go down to see the total absorption, it has that small little hump there. That essentially is what man-made global warming gas is. That's the part of the infrared spectrum that is unique to CO2. And man produces 5% of that little tiny peak. So if you take a look at this one, you can see where I have the blue dots. That means that CO2 is irrelevant. If you go over to the next one where I have those brown dots, that is what is unique to CO2. So that right there is essentially what man-made global warming greenhouse gas effect is. The whole argument is that little gray area, 5% of that little gray area is what's causing all these catastrophic problems. You go over a little bit further and you have the last peak of CO2.
On the bottom line.
On the bottom line, you can see, once again, you have absorption over there at 15 microns. I should go back. The bottom axis here is wavelength in microns. The vertical axis is the total absorptivity. So as you can see, as you're going from left to right, the wavelength is increasing in length, meaning you're lowering the energy of that wavelength. But as you can see, you only really have 2 very small areas of the infrared spectrum that's being absorbed by CO2. That first little gray area, or the first little, brown, and then at the very end, a little bit of the red. And if you take it, now I'm going to zoom in on that 15 microns, and you can see, sure enough, that's all we're talking about. When you're talking about global warming being caused by CO2, you're talking about an almost infinitesimally small sector of an infrared wavelength spectrum that doesn't, out of the total picture, contains very little energy to begin with, and 2, we're only producing 5%. So this little pimple, we're not even a whitehead on this little pimple. So that's our contribution for this entire problem. And that's the whole point, is that what we're being told to believe is those 2 little bands of infrared absorption is what's causing all these problems. That's what I don't buy. And I think if you start to look at the data, you'll find that more than likely, if we go back and you look there, what is the most likely cause? Would a huge change in CO2 be more likely than a very small change in water vapor? If I had a very small change in water vapor, would it not overwhelm any major increase in CO2?
Well, here's what it seems to be coming down to, right? The point that you keep making. You keep making the point that our contribution of CO2 and presumably other gases too, is small compared to all the natural contribution of greenhouse gases, including water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas. And that's true, it is small. But the point is that this small contribution is what's changing the balance. That small contribution is building up over time more and more and causing more and more warming. So yeah, it's great that all these water vapor and other gases that are naturally produced keep temperatures what's livable. But it's that small difference that has increased temperatures by 1 degree over the past century, and that's a small amount. But when you think about it,
so
we're
what you're
predicted to
saying,
have about 10 degrees, up to 10 degrees in the next century, which is as much as the difference between the last ice age, when we had a mile of ice over New York City. So that small difference can have a big impact.
so what you're saying is man produces CO2, it goes up in the atmosphere and it stays there. What you're saying is that there's no net effect. If man produces CO2, it goes up and it stays there. Mother Nature's
Not forever.
For a certain period of time.
Mother Nature is not maintaining homeostasis. Mother Nature's not maintaining the balance. You're saying man is able to tip the balance because when we put CO2 in the atmosphere, it's different than when Mother Nature burns down a forest or puts up a volcano. You're saying that man is tipping the balance because when man puts CO2 up there, Mother Nature can't handle it. It's accumulating versus being managed. Is that? I mean, that's the theory, right?
That's right. I mean, naturally, there are all sorts of things that release CO2, and there are all sorts of things that absorb it, like trees and oceans. And there's a more or less a balance. Things do change over time for different reasons, but they usually change relatively slowly. The changes that we're causing and the resulting temperature increases we're causing seem to be pretty unprecedented. And that's what's so dangerous.
Okay.
Especially when you look at the dangers that we're facing. We're facing things like flooding of cities, spreading of tropical diseases that would kill countless people, and extreme weather disasters, stronger hurricanes, stronger precipitation, droughts,
Fire, the Arctic
melting,
these are
polar
serious
bears,
things. And when
drowning.
scientists are telling us there's a 90% chance that we're responsible, it would be crazy not to take some precautions. Not to say, look, even if people like you are not sure, let's play it safe and not do something crazy when we're 90% confident.
I'm
That's
not
pretty
disagreeing
confident.
that global warming is going on. What I'm disagreeing with is if you're going to claim that CO2 is the cause, you better have some solid data to show that. And what I'm saying, there's a serious lack of data showing. Now, for
The
instance,
scientists seem to disagree. They
But-
seem to think
but
they're
also,
90%
I would
sure.
like
but
to-
let's get to what the data is that the scientists.
But I don't know. I think one of the things Noam Mohr has written an article in Earth Save International. I just want to, because I mean we can come back to that, but just to get that in, that he's written this article in Earth Save International at earthsave.org /global warming, which really actually says something very similar, that CO2, all the cars, power plants, and CO2 emissions put together are not as global warming producing as the methane and nitrous oxide gas from the meat and dairy industry. And he points to the fact that the sources, the things that put out, the cars, trucks, power plants that put out the carbon dioxide emissions, that they also put out aerosols. They put out like dust and dirt clouds, which actually do cloud the sun and therefore prevent as much heat from coming to the earth. And so it's kind of, it can come to a neutral, so that the CO2s may add to the global warming effect, but the aerosols that are produced at the same time put a negative effect, and the net result is neutral. So we are in accord with you about that, and we feel that the meat and dairy industry, with its methane and nitrous oxide gases, which as a whole are 275 times more global warming producing over your last
20 years.
over 20 years, as opposed to over 100 years, 296 times, that 3 meals a day, every single person can, in their own way, adopt a vegan, vegetarian diet and slow down or eliminate meat and dairy.
If they choose to eat rice, though?
If they choose to eat rice, then you have a human being consuming rice. If you choose to eat dead animal flesh or milk or dairy or eggs, then you're having a human being eating an animal that on the whole aggregate, as a whole, is consuming 80% of all the rice
my
that's
point
being made.
My point is, if we don't eat the cow, we're going to have to eat the rice, so we're going to have to expand our rice production, which is expanding methane-producing fields. The thing about how this whole effect is that CO2 is absorbing the sunlight, trapping the heat, and leading to global warming, correct? Now, if that's the case, we know that CO2 is evenly dispersed throughout the globe, correct? If you take a core sample in Antarctica, you get 380 parts per million. If you go to the equator, you get 380 parts per million. If you go up to the North Pole, you get 380 parts per million. If you go up in the atmosphere, you still get 380 parts per million. Is that a correct statement?
Yes.
Okay, so we have established that throughout the world, throughout the atmosphere, CO2 is evenly dispersed. Now, if greenhouse gas effect is the trapping of solar radiation, which it is, wouldn't you expect the areas where the majority of the sunlight falls to be warming relative to the area where less sunlight is falling?
Well, it's complicated. That's certainly one factor, but there's a lot of other factors that go on. For example, if the ground is light color, a lot of that light will be reflected. While if it's a dark color, the ground will absorb that light, heating it up, and that heat will again get trapped by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so it won't radiate out into space. That's an example of something where, for example, Arctic ice will keep the Earth cooler when it's there, but when the ice melts and you have the ocean, which is a darker color, that will cause more warming of the Earth. So it's complicated, and there's a lot of things that affect local temperature things, including the winds and the circulation of the ocean. But people have put all this stuff in their models. They've tried to calculate with increasing and increasing confidence all these details. And what they find is that what was predicted, that increasing our levels of not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and so on, should have an effect on global climate that matches what the effect that we're actually seeing.
Okay, well, what you're making. Let me just get back to the one point though. Would you not? I mean, the oceans are an incredibly efficient absorber of solar radiation. Would you not agree? Would you say that the ocean warms more and holds heat better than the Earth, than the land area?
Yes.
Okay, and you have more oceans in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere, correct?
That's true.
Okay, so if you have more sunlight that does in fact fall in the southern hemisphere, you got the oceans absorbing more solar radiation. Wouldn't you then expect, because it is being caused by CO2, that the southern hemisphere would be warming relative to the northern hemisphere?
Not necessarily, because that's just one factor out of many.
But I'm just saying, okay, so we've got one recorded, not necessarily. I'm going to go through a bunch of them. I guarantee you, every time I point out these inconsistencies, you're going to say not necessarily. And I think what you find is that this theory is built on a lot of not necessarilies, because every time you point out a logical conclusion, the answer has to be not necessarily, because when you look at it, you think, okay, if in fact it's infrared radiation being absorbed by CO2, you'd have to say, okay, well then first, ceteris paribus, all else held equal, I would assume that the area that gets the majority of the sunlight would be warming relative to the area that doesn't. You don't. You find what you actually find is that you have northern hemisphere warming, and some studies actually show that you have southern hemisphere cooling. So you don't really even have global warming. Some studies show that you have northern hemisphere warming and southern hemisphere cooling. The other problem you have is that you're making the claim that CO2 released by man or by anything goes up and stays in the atmosphere. That's not true. For one, the IPCC, this organization that you put a great deal of faith in, who relies upon a global warming potential for their models, doesn't even assign a global warming potential to water vapor, the most significant greenhouse gas out there. They don't assign a global warming potential to it. How could anyone have a model that doesn't include the most significant variable? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. And if you don't have a global warming potential to it, I don't care what kind of models they have, and I don't care what kind of agreement you have it. It's junk a model. It's like doing a model on exercise and forgetting to include exercise and caloric intake. You know, it's a very good. And as far as the accuracy of these models, I've seen the people speak at Ohio State. I saw the person who runs the models, who builds the model, who spent over $250 million to build the model. And what you're saying is an accurate model, he makes very clear we're highly inaccurate. And the way that he solved this problem of not getting good results is he went and bragged about spending another $500 million to get another model that wasn't giving him very good results. And this is the gentleman that we'll get to in a little bit. He brags about the fact that their models aren't very good, but it gives him more money to spend. And that's what he does. He'll tell you the atmospheric content. We didn't get good results. Henry's law is the fusion of a gas in a liquid. Henry's law basically states that the fusion of a gas is inversely related to temperature. It's like if you take a pop bottle and shake it up, you'll see CO2 will fly out of it. If you take that same pop bottle, put it on a burner, turn up the heat, CO2 will fly out of it. Mother Nature determines the equilibrium of atmospheric CO2. If too much CO2 is put up there, she would absorb it. If it wasn't enough, she would release it. If man decides to pull CO2 out and she doesn't like it, she'll release it. The only way this idea that man producing CO2 goes up there and stays is if in fact the oceans are saturated with CO2, and there's no evidence of that. More importantly, to getting back to it, why are the oceans releasing CO2? Would you agree that the oceans are warming?
The oceans are warming.
Okay, now,
Absolutely.
there is no evidence showing that the greenhouse gas effect can warm the oceans because the oceans absorb all the infrared and $250 million to build the model. And what you're saying is an accurate model. He makes very clear we're highly inaccurate. And the way that he solved this problem of not getting good results is he went and bragged about spending another $500 million to get another model that wasn't giving him very good results. And this is the gentleman that we'll get to in a little bit. He brags about the fact that their models aren't very good, but it gives him more money to spend. And that's what he does. He'll tell you, we didn't get good results. That's why the point is inversely related to CO2. It's like if you take a pop bottle and shake it up, you'll see CO2 will fly out of it. If you take that same pop bottle, put it on a burner, turn up the heat, CO2 will fly out of it. Mother Nature determines the equilibrium of atmospheric CO2. If too much CO2 is put up there, she would absorb it. If it wasn't enough, she would release it. If man decides to pull CO2 out and she doesn't like it, she'll release it. The only way this idea that man producing CO2 goes up there and stays is if in fact the oceans are saturated with CO2, and there's no evidence of that. More importantly, to getting back to it, why are the oceans releasing CO2? Would you agree that the oceans are warming?
The oceans are warming.
Okay, now,
Absolutely.
there is no evidence showing that the greenhouse gas effect can warm the oceans because the oceans absorb all the infrared in the very top micro layer. The other areas of the wavelength are what's warming the deeper oceans. So you've got a phenomenon going on where you have the oceans warming and the atmosphere warming. Now, a normal scientist would say, you know what? Probably the same thing that's warming the oceans is also warming the atmosphere. Global warming theory relies on the fact that there's some other natural phenomenon warming the oceans, but man is what's causing the atmosphere to warm. My argument is that the same thing that's warming the oceans is the same thing that's warming the atmosphere. And unless you repeal Davis's law, this idea that man can produce CO2 up there and Mother Nature doesn't have anything to say about it just doesn't work.
The underlying assumption behind all your comments is that all the scientists that work on this, they haven't thought of all of these things. You're trying to focus on one fact and not look at the whole.
That's a pretty doggone
And
good
can I ask you what your solution would
as
be?
I was saying, if man produces CO2 and she doesn't like it, she's going to absorb it. The other thing is this idea of a residence life. You know, they come up with
She meaning Mother Nature?
Mother Nature. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, the other thing is this residency life. If you're going to sit there and once again, you've got these models that you're putting a lot of faith in, okay? Part of that, the global warming potential calculation is based upon the residency life of a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, right? And I just demonstrated to you how as you increase the time span, the global warming potential varies, right?
Gets increased, it
Gets
seems.
increased. Now, if I'm going to sit there and I'm going to have a global warming potential calculation, first I'm going to need one for water vapor, which does not exist. And two, I'm going to need to have an incredibly accurate estimate of the residency life of my CO2 in the atmosphere, right? It's a big difference if CO2 stays up there for 5 years or 1,000 years, correct? Because it really would accumulate if it was 1,000 years. It wouldn't accumulate very much, if at all, for 5 years, right? Now, wouldn't you think the IPC would have some accurate estimates of what the residency life is of carbon dioxide? What would you say is a fair estimate? If I was going to say, tell me what the residency life of CO2 is, what would you like the IPCC to see, say, within a certain range?
Well, it's
5
around
to 7
between
years?
50 to 100 years, somewhere in there, for carbon dioxide.
So you're saying 50 to 100 years?
Roughly.
Okay. The IPC estimates it to be between 5 and 200. But we've all heard those estimates of 100 years plus, right? I have a slide in here that shows there's an estimate of it being 400 years. But being a physicist and having a chemistry background, I'm pretty sure, I would imagine, how would you prove that? How would you prove the residency life of a gas in the atmosphere?
Listen, this is outside my area of research. I focus mostly on solutions to global warming.
Okay.
And to me, I just know that the scientists that have a virtual consensus about this, they've taken all these things into account. And I would encourage people who are interested to go to the websites of science that, for example, the EPA's website or the Union of Concerned Scientists or any website that discusses all these details. An area of expertise. So,
But okay, so what Paula was just asking about is what absorbs more heat and therefore contributes more to greenhouse gases. And
right. So there are two factors involved. One is how powerful a gas is at warming the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the one people talk most about, but methane is 23 times more powerful over 100 years. And as Rob said, it's 67 times more powerful over a shorter time span. And you have other gases like nitrous oxide, which are hundreds, some are thousands of times more powerful. Water vapor is another powerful global warming gas.
And water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas, responsible for more than 95% of all the greenhouse gas effect.
That's absolutely right.
Now, given the fact that water vapor is the most significant greenhouse gas, can we agree on that one? Water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll defer to you now.
Now, given that, wouldn't it be logical to take a look and see, has there been anything that changes atmospheric water vapor? Because it's a small change in 95% would be the equivalent of a huge change of this little 5% down here. So wouldn't it be more logical to think maybe there's
5%, excuse me, of
CO2.
carbon dioxide?
Yeah, because what you're talking about
But
is
we're not, okay.
you've got CO2, which is a trace gas, and you've got this big gorilla in the living room, which is water vapor. A small change in atmospheric water vapor, just a small change, would be a huge change for CO2, correct? It wouldn't take me very much change in atmospheric water vapor to overwhelm any kind of an increase in CO2, right?
It could.
It could. Now, wouldn't it be interesting that if I went and I dug up some data that shows you that we're increasing atmospheric water vapor a lot, wouldn't you then start to think, well, that increase in water vapor is probably what's due to the global warming gas?
Not due to.
Or causing the global warming? And wouldn't it also be more interesting that if you found out that the area of the world that is warming also corresponds with the area that has the increase in water vapor in the atmosphere?
Well, that's an interesting point, because one of the things that scientists have done research on is they show that as we increase our carbon dioxide and other global warming gases that we emit into the atmosphere, that will not only directly warm the atmosphere, but it will also have a feedback loop where it causes more evaporation and therefore have more water vapor in the air. So it affects not just directly, but indirectly through water vapor.
But wouldn't you also think the evaporation is being caused by whatever is causing the oceans to warm in general? And we know that the greenhouse gas effect isn't warming the oceans. So wouldn't you be thinking that whatever's warming the oceans is probably also what's causing the increase in the...
On the contrary, we believe that one of the reasons the ocean is warming is because of global warming. As temperatures rise in the ocean as well.
As you explained about the colors absorbing.
But let me be very clear about what I'm saying. The greenhouse gas effect does not warm the oceans. The deep oceans are warming. Okay, there's only one thing that's warming the deep oceans, and that's the sun. And so, if the oceans are warming, you probably have to say it's probably the sun that's causing it. More importantly, is not only do we have global warming here on Earth, we have global warming on Mars and Pluto. So it's not appropriate to say we have global warming. We have solar system warming. But once again, it gets back to a natural cause. You can't.
But Bob, wouldn't you say that the sun is being absorbed into the ocean more when there's more darkness in the ocean, in other words, when more of the snow caps and the Arctic region starts to melt due to global warming. So the more darkness of the ocean, the more, black absorbs heat more. So it's cyclical in terms of that it is not just solar. Yes, it is absorbing the sun, but it is absorbing the sun because there's more dark space on the ocean because the white snows and Arctic ices are melting and therefore not reflecting
you do have a point.
Earth
That's called
light.
albedo. And you're right. As you decrease the solar cap, you're getting more reflected light. However, if there was global warming, you would expect a uniform shrinking of the polar ice caps, correct? You'd expect warm here, it would be like an ice cube melting from the outside in. What you do is when you look at the polar ice caps, you don't see that. What you see is a certain area melting, which is consistent with a warming ocean and currents, not with global warming. The other thing is and actually, Paul, I'm going to change
But
this.
they go together.
But
there are currents that make the heat move to certain areas according to the natural
but the
cycles
cause
of
and
the
effect
currents.
Once again, is something gets warmed first, and then there's a cause. You warm the oceans, and then it starts to melt. More importantly, this is a great example on how you're
Going to a chart?
I'm going to change the slide here, and you're talking about these polar ice caps melting, right?
It's too
This
cold
is-
to see very well.
Is that hard to see?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is in the news today, and I'll just give a real quick rundown on it. Did you read about the California-sized part of Antarctica that's melting?
Yes.
Okay, and then right here it is. California-sized area of ice melts in Antarctica. Now, when you read that, and when almost anyone reads that, and what the headline is, what do you think they're implying? What is that supposed to be telling you?
That global warming is increasing very rapidly.
Exactly.
No, well, it only says that the ice is melting. It doesn't say the reason. And in fact, if you read further in, they say global warming might be a cause, but it might not. It's too early to tell, which is different than when we study the Arctic and we see dramatic changes. Throughout the Arctic, it's lost half its thickness.
More actually, half its thickness. Once again, that is consistent with the warming of the ocean, not the atmosphere. But when you see
They're related.
and this is I'll get to that. When I read that, I thought they're going to claim global warming as causing the Larsen B shelf, right? What Al Gore uses in his movie, the Larsen B shelf disappears. What caused the Larsen B shelf, according to Al Gore, to disappear? Global warming, correct? I mean, we can all agree that they show these melting ice polar caps to say global warming is causing it.
Yeah.
Well, look here. This is what's going on, and sure enough, there is an area of warming going on where this is the Ross ice shelf and it's melting, and you see these little pockets of heat. First of all, global warming would be a unified warming. This is local.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be real obvious here in a second. Okay? But you wouldn't expect to see local heating like this under global warming. Okay? Many people don't understand that that's on a fault. You have multiple volcanoes around that area. Most importantly, and Paul right there shows you all the volcanoes that are underneath the melting ice shelf. Here, this comes from the Geological Survey, and you can see you've got 3 major volcanoes that are active right where, this is where the Penguin and the Deception happens to be where the Larsen B shelf was. Okay? Al Gore claims global warming melted that. Right here where the new California-sized ice shelf is melting happens to be on Mount Erebus, which is actually, as it points out here, you can see steam coming out of it. So once again, you can blame global warming, but I think it's more logical for someone to look at that and say, you know what, the volcano is probably doing it. More importantly, what I find interesting, and these are the scientists that you put a lot of faith in, they're going out there and there was a lot of hype about this Larsen B shelf. Did you know that there is a volcano discovered after the fact of the Larsen B shelf? On this one, you can see scientists discover undersea volcano off Antarctica that just happens to be under the Larsen B shelf, and it's active in warming the oceans. I found this out after the fact, but I can't ever remember Al Gore coming out and having a correction saying, oh, by the way, I know I got you scared about that Larsen B shelf. I told you it was global warming, but after I did a little bit of search and they went out to find out what caused it, the actual cause that they found for the Larsen B shelf was an active volcano underneath it. I never heard anyone tell me that. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with your scientists is that when they do find things like this, that doesn't make the headlines. Did you even know that there's a volcano underneath the Larsen B shelf?
I think your complaint is not with the scientists, but with the reporters, what they choose to report.
And
There's a big difference between Antarctica and the Arctic, because there's been a lot of warming of the Arctic that we can see, and we can link to global warming. It's shrinking in size and in thinness for decades. There are not many scientists who would say with confidence that the Larsen B ice shelf or any other part of the Antarctic is melting or breaking apart because of warming. Things like this might be hints that maybe something is happening, but that's a long way from what scientists are saying in a consensus, that there's a 90% chance that humans are causing global warming and that the effects are dire.
Sure. But I want to make sure my position is really clear known. What you're saying is, and I'm sure you've dealt with forecast models. These are all A, forecast models, but B, you're telling everybody to have faith in a model that does not assign a global warming potential to water vapor.
Can I ask you, Bob,
Sure.
what is your solution? We have one that has rarely been put out there. We've gotten on tiny little, to the destruction of our planet right now.
Do you want to know?
And that is eliminating meat and dairy from one's diet. And we're presenting a different aspect in terms. Do you have a solution? What it seems to me is that your solution is to disempower people. In other words, what you're saying to the audience.
What's the problem? First,
What you're saying to the audience is that you cannot do anything. That it's Mother Nature, that it's out of your hands. And what we're saying is that 3 meals a day, you can do a lot.
Okay, well, I've got a solution.
I are of one mind, and Bob is of one mind. And the fact of the matter is that on some levels we share commonalities, and on others we don't. And what we're doing in this dialogue, in this dance of relating to the audience and relating to each other and sharing things we know, is we're comparing and contrasting and getting to know each other and what our opinions and facts and information are. So we feel that it's very important that if there is a solution, that if global warming does exist, and if there is a solution, that at least people have the option to decide whether they want to take that solution or not. But if we don't present it, we won't be able to.
Well, let's take a look at the solutions. Have you seen the solutions for what they expect to pay to meet the Kyoto Treaty requirements? Have you looked at those expectations?
Yes.
What you have to look at also is the cost of doing nothing,
Sure.
which is dramatic. It's dramatic.
Well, now let's follow up on this cost of doing nothing. When I was a kid, they told me there was a coming ice age. When I was younger than you, they told me there was a coming ice age. And what they told us back then is what we need to do is literally rush out, pour black soot on the North Pole, and melt it to warm the Earth. So had we not done something back then, had we used that argument back then, we would have melted the polar ice caps, and we would have killed those polar bears that they're worried about today. So rushing to judgment based on bad science can be awful. And so what you have to take a look at is what exactly are they talking about doing? I mean, they're talking about spending 3 to 5% of GDP to solve this carbon problem.
And we're talking about spending absolutely no money, and as a matter of fact, less money, by going vegetarian, vegan, no meat, no dairy, no eggs. And that costs people not only nothing, but it costs people less. Because the price of polluting, the meat and dairy industry does pollute this planet more than anything else, especially water.
Sure.
And it does misuse.
But
I
what I'm
think the
saying
global
is
cooling.
the government is talking about spending 3 to 5% of our GDP. So
Right, we're
if
not
they're
supporting
going
the government
vegan or going
position.
vegetarian that's a nice little idea. But my point is, what are the people in power going to do with this idea? And if it keeps getting pushed, what they're going to do is they're going to want to take, and I've never seen the government estimate be low. So when you're talking 3 to 5% of GDP, you're going to be taking money out of the working American's pocket to give to the government to fight global warming one way or the other. But we could be spending that same amount on education, Social Security, all the social issues that we have. We could be better focused our money, have higher priority. In my eyes, we just simply have higher priorities in this country to worry about
Yes,
the global
I think
warming.
that what they'll do is spend that money and give it to oil companies to try to find ways of using finding alternative
Well,
energy.
That's a pretty bad argument for supporting this global warming, because that's what the government's going to do, is going to take the tax.
But we're not
and give it to the oil
supporting that
companies.
global warming.
Education and Social Security and all these issues are also extremely important. But we should never say Social Security is really important, so we shouldn't worry about terrorism. We have to worry about both, because we have to look at the price of not doing something. We need to spend money on education because our future depends on it. And we also need to spend money on doing something about global warming, or take actions to do something about global warming, many of which will save money, because the price of doing nothing is disastrous. We saw what happened with Hurricane Katrina, and that was just one hurricane. Can you imagine what would happen with all the predictions of 10-degree difference in global temperatures were to happen?
That's a big
It's
if.
critical.
I mean,
and the thing
an
is,
infinite number of ifs.
I
The
think
point
that-
is, look at how fast the oceans are rising right now. You're talking millimeters a year. To come up anywhere close to a meter, you're talking thousands of years. So these
But not
forecasts,
necessarily, because things accelerate. The rate at which things accelerates.
That's it.
So
I-
we don't know how fast.
it's because carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, but it stays there for a long time. So when we add more carbon dioxide there, we're not just continuing to heat, we're adding it to the carbon dioxide that's already there.
Okay.
And so you see an exponential increase is predicted.
Okay,
and
now-
we have seen unprecedented increases that match that. I think
Okay, we're going to wrap up slowly. We have just a little bit of time.
Well, I do want to make sure that for everyone who's listening, it's hard for people to assess the science when they hear one person saying one statistics and another person saying another statistics. It's hard to weigh who's right.
So you can see where, especially totalitarian states, where they could take this kind of an argument and run with it.
I agree with you, and I heard you on YouTube speaking about that. And I think that I know, George Bush Sr. was very much into population control, and he was supported.
He was?
You read the book? Very much into it, and his father, Prescott Bush, who was indicted by had a Malthusian policy, really, is to get rid of as many people so that they could rise on top and sell as many goods, raise their prices. It is Malthusian, and basically what it is killing as many people, or destroying, or euthanasia. Eugenics, which is sterilizing people, or lobotomy.
And what you're saying is an accurate model. He makes very clear we're highly inaccurate. And the way that he solved this problem of not getting good results is he went and bragged about spending another $500 million to get another model that wasn't giving him very good results. And this is the gentleman that we'll get to in a little bit. He brags about the fact that their models aren't very good, but it gives him more money to spend.